Merry Christmas and welcome to Moderate Fantasy Violence, a podcast about pop culture and the world around it. I'm jolly old Saint Nick.
And I'm Alastair.
And this week we'll be discussing Rogue One, a Star Wars story, the new Star Wars film about Star Wars, The Man in the High Castle, a new series from Amazon based on the novel by Philip K. Dick, and Birth of a Nation, the new biopic of Nat Turner, who led a slave rebellion in 1831. And then I've finally seen Die Hard, so we'll be talking about what I thought of it and whether it really is the best Christmas film ever. But before all that, Alastair, what festive things have you been festively doing in the last festive fortnight?
Well, I haven't done anything especially festive apart from, work Christmas dues, getting drunk, eating mince pies, I guess, the usual.
Yep, check.
I went to see the new production of An Inspector Calls, which is on in London right now. It's the play you probably remember from GCSE English Literature, if you're British.
We didn't do it.
Did you have Christmas Carol or something instead?
I think in terms of plays, we did The Crucible and A Streetcar Named Desire.
The Crucible's really good.
It is really good.
They're doing a production of An Inspector Calls in London right now. It is a really good production. It's a great play. It was written during the Second World War, but it's set in sort of 1913, just on the eve of the outbreak of the First World War. And obviously it's about a wealthy family who collectively they've each done slightly unpleasant or selfish things to the same woman, and it's all added up, to driving her to taking her own life. It's a real sort of biting piece of, not necessarily satire, it's a biting critique of the callousness of the class system with a lot of sort of warnings for the future. And it's very appropriate right now. There's a great production on in London. I hadn't read the play or seen a film adaptation since I did it for GCSE, but it was great to revisit it, and it reminded me of how good the play is. Also, random piece of trivia, there was a famous film adaptation of An Inspector Calls starring Alastair Sim as the titular inspector, and I'm named after Alastair Sim, so there you go.
Oh, okay.
It's like the only thing that most people know that Alastair Sim has been in, because everyone, like most people's English teachers show them. If they're doing An Inspector Calls for GCSE, most people watch that film.
I've never heard of Alastair Sim before. Fair enough.
Anyway, Nick, what have you been doing in the run-up to Christmas to get yourself in the festive mood?
Equally, not actually festively, I've been watching the 4-part Flash, Arrow, Legends of Tomorrow, technically also Supergirl crossover, which has been built up to in the last few weeks of massive amounts of promotion, and finally actually happened this week. And yeah, it was mostly pretty good, impressively. With something that ridiculous and that overhyped, and which is obviously that big an undertaking, you kind of expect it to end up being rubbish, but it was actually fun for what it was. The villains were a bit, here's some evil aliens, and as well as being the crossover week, it was Arrow's 100th episode, so they had to ram a load of sort of celebratory heroes of old characters back stuff into the middle of the crossover, which was a bit weird. And I imagine if you haven't been watching Arrow, possibly a bit incomprehensible. But fortunately, I follow all the shows because I just love it. So yeah, fine for me. And it ended up being a lot of fun. I think there's been some very mild blowback about the fact that the Supergirl part of the air quotes 4-part crossover actually just involves a normal episode of Supergirl with the Flash turning up at the end to go, come and take part in our crossover. And some people feel this is false advertising. It is a bit weird, and to be honest, I would have quite happily taken a bit more crossover, but whatever.
Do they find an adequate role for all the characters in the story? Because one of the things this reminds me of is under Russell T Davies, when he was writing Doctor Who, he would always have a kind of, let's bring back loads of, former companions, characters for a series finale. And sometimes it did feel like they've just putting in characters for characters' sake, and they kind of just turn up to kind of wave at the camera and disappear slightly. It
mostly works, I think. Some of the less prominent, I was going to say less interesting, but less prominent and less interesting characters in Legends of Tomorrow did get a bit stand around, just turn up and wave. But for the most part, yeah, I think everyone got at least a couple of lines. These shows have been going on for years. Like, most of the characters in Legends of Tomorrow are characters who used to be in sort of guest roles in Arrow and Flash. So most of them have at least some history with someone else who's in the crossover, so they can sort of go, it's you, or they can go, hey, that guy you used to know, he's dead now, or something. The Arrow anniversary stuff, where a bunch of old characters did basically turn up just to show up and wave. I didn't realise how long I'd been waiting to hear John Barrowman turn up, say about 3 lines, and then leave. Yeah, some of that was a bit sort of, oh, it's you. Okay, bye.
I'm glad John Barrowman is still getting work after the death of Torchwood.
Yeah, he seems to have managed to parlay his Captain Jack thing into this sort of ongoing role in the Flash Arrowverse. Apparently he's signed some sort of general contract, so he's not actually a regular character on any one show, he's a regular character in the shows as a whole, which is the sort of thing they do now, apparently.
Oh, right.
So he just turns up and is villainous. Maybe he might make it to Supergirl, but technically that takes place in another universe, so... Yeah, anyway, yes, it was, considering what a massive clunky undertaking it must have been. I mean, the limitations did show, like, these shows do not have a bumload of money, and some of the alien CGI stuff was a bit video game cutscene-y. But considering, it was pretty good. And certainly these shows are the things that remind me most of all the current comic media-related things. These shows are the things that remind me the most of the experience of being about 14, let's be honest, and reading sort of fun, if slightly forgettable, superhero comics. You know, the sort of the silliness, the overwrought emotion, the pointless crossover team-up stuff. It's very much bringing that back for me. And now, first up, definitely the headliner in recent pop culture releases, it's Rogue One, A Star Wars Story, the latest Star Wars franchise film, which is part of what I think they're technically calling the anthology films, or the anthology series or something, the films that come out in alternate years to the proper episodes. And this is a backstory entry that takes place shortly before the events of Episode 4, A New Hope. So yep, this is directed by Gareth Edwards and stars Felicity Jones and a cast of rogues and miscreants who are undertaking a massive heist to steal the plans for the Death Star, which of course sets up the events of A New Hope. And this came out a few days ago. It looks like being one of the big action special effects genre films of the year. Alastair, what did you think of it?
I really liked it. It was just really entertaining. I mean, like, Star Wars films, especially the original trilogy, have always been these just like really entertaining roller coasters, visually spectacular, engaging characters. You know, that's the kind of the essence of Star Wars. You know, one of the things that made the George Lucas prequel trilogy so unbearable is that they just weren't that exciting. It was just more about like the internal politics of the Jedi and Anakin being a bit moody and emo. So yeah, they kind of lost the fun aspect, and I kind of feel that now that Disney's taken over these films, they've realised that we've got to get back to them being fun and exciting. That's kind of the main point in them. And this one even more so felt like it could just be like fun and exciting. It didn't have the weight of being a full episode, you know, that level of pressure. It didn't have the aspect of, you know, there's been 3 bad Star Wars films and people's sort of perception of Star Wars has been lowered, so we need to kind of convince people that we can do good Star Wars films because, you know, Episode 7 had done all of that. It just felt like this could be a film, you know, it just had to be out there, fun and entertaining, and it was, so I was very pleased with it.
Yeah, I thought it was pretty good. I think The Force Awakens was probably better, or at least I think it succeeded in what it was trying to do a bit more, but this was pretty good, I think. Lots of big, exciting action stuff, usually not that long between big, exciting action bits, but you know, just about enough talking so you care about the characters. I felt it almost fell a bit into the similar trap to what I talked about with Doctor Strange a few weeks back, in that I don't know if I necessarily felt super duper with it and invested in terms of the characters. I was sort of like, yes, okay, I know you seem alright. Although I quite liked the two sort of warriors who might have been a couple. It was sort of very gently implied that these 2 male warriors were in a relationship, but this being family-friendly Star Wars lands, they didn't actually make them explicitly gay. I don't know. I guess it's the factional march forward of progress. Yeah, like a lot of sort of good heist or caper films, there was a good sort of range of characters who could do different things and had enough personality to give them something to do in the ensemble, but not to overpower the main journey, which is Jyn and her relationship with her father.
I think the Jyn character, the main character, was very good. Like a lot of these films, you need, like, it's only one strong main character that people like and are invested in to support the weight of the film. I think Marvel have got very good at creating these main characters to be their titular superheroes. From the beginning, you kind of, I get the sense that I quite like you, I'm invested in you as a character, I want to see where you go and what your personal journey is. And that really makes the film much more watchable. And I thought the Jyn character in Rogue One was very good. I mean, you know, it opens with her childhood and her dad, played by Max Mikkelsen, being taken away to work on, you know, what we know becomes the Death Star. You kind of get her grown up and she's a serial rebel, just rebelling against everything, and kind of gets drawn into the more, you know, formal rebellion, kind of first against her will, but then is brought around to, you know, doing the right thing. I thought Felicity Jones played the character really well, kind of gave her real personality.
I think a lot of what made it work was Felicity Jones' performance, to be honest. They gave the character the backstory, but she didn't really have that many, I don't know, revealing or even casual conversations, did she, at any point during the film?
No.
There wasn't really much of her talking about how she felt or having a chat with someone to bring across her personality. It was just this sort of, you get the backstory, then after that, it's just her doing her thing with this sort of steeliness.
No, you don't get a lot of characterization because, again, this is a story that is mainly focused on moving the plot forwards. Yeah, which is fine because it's all executed well. I think it's done very efficiently. Like, you get a bit of her backstory at the beginning, and then there's no need for any flashbacks or more embellishments. It's established what the emotional stakes of the film are, and then kind of goes on to tell the story rather than feeling the need to added complexity to the main character. You can be over characterized. No one wants the plot of this film to stop so they could have a kind of a big detailed discussion about how the characters feel about things, because it would just take all the tension out of the film.
I don't know, I think that's possibly what led to that sort of strange sense of dryness. There wasn't really, at no point, no one stopped to have a chat of either an emotional chat or even just a sort of a fun chat about what was going on around them. It was very all business. It was a very get in and get the job done film, which I guess if nothing else reflects the tone of the mission.
Yeah, but also, I don't know, there's definitely a few films I've seen this year that are kind of groaning under the weight of sort of added portents and extra they feel they need to do big character bits and big thematic bits to kind of embellish their story, partly because I think they labour under the misapprehension that these films are significant and therefore need these things. Also kind of reflects a lack of belief that the story itself is good enough to sustain the film. I'm pretty much subtweeting Batman v Superman now in a quite passive-aggressive way. But what I liked about Rogue One, which I think it did really well, and where things like Suicide Squad and Batman v Superman were let down, is Rogue One had a really tight, efficient story that it had this great story to tell, and you just it started and it took you on the story, and then every moment kind of propelled that story forwards. There were no bits when I felt you could cut this, you could drop this, or I was sat there thinking oh, this is dragging a bit, or the pace is off. For the whole thing, I was just kind of swept up in it, carried along by it, so which shows it's a great story.
Yeah, but mostly I think it did propel itself along, and I think what you said about it being self-contained and not feeling the need to set up a million other things is one of the reasons why I think this has been fairly well received, because in a year where a lot of films have been sort of groaning under the weight of setting up a franchise, the fact that this is a story that for the most part just exists and has a beginning, middle and end. I mean, yes, it's an end that feeds very heavily into A New Hope. I won't explicitly spoil it yet, we may do some spoilers later, but it's very tightly woven into the canon. But the story itself has a beginning, middle and end, and I think that's refreshing. I think that's probably one reason why a lot of people have gone, yes, this is good, this is new and different and good. And it's also what made some of the times they did go off book and do something connected to the wider universe, if anything, feel a bit weird. I mean, the random C-3PO cameo, I will admit, I did mostly just sit there going, this doesn't fit.
That's as you say, is one of those things that's necessary because it relates to the wider Star Wars arc, and I guess they felt they needed to connect this film up to the other films, like A New Hope specifically, so that means there had to be a little bit where C-3PO appears. I think some of the other bits where they were connecting it to the wider Star Wars universe worked really well, like having Darth Vader in it. I thought was really good. First, I thought when I realised Darth Vader was going to be in this film, I thought, oh, are they just going to shoehorn him in because everyone loves Darth Vader and stuff? But they didn't use him too much. He appeared for just a couple of scenes. But I thought he really worked. He kind of reminded you of why, especially we all know probably too much about Darth Vader at this point. Basically, we know what his backstory is and where he grew up and his family, and it kind of took away from him that kind of menace that he had the first time you watch, episode 4, and he kind of just appears and he's been evil and choking people at will and just generally storming around being angry and villainous. And some of that has been taken away mainly by substandard prequel films filling in his backstory. But in this film, he worked really well, again, as just a kind of menacing evil presence, and reminded you why he's so badass and why he's one of the most iconic film villains of all time. Yeah,
I think, much as I would have maybe liked a bit more characterisation on Jyn, I think less is definitely more with Darth Vader. I think that was one element of connection they definitely got right, yes. I'll give you that one.
Yeah.
So speaking of old characters coming back, I think I'm probably just going to have to call full spoilers at this stage. We should probably talk about this, but it is basically talking about a spoiler. So if you don't want to hear about some cameos from the old film, including one that happened in literally the last few seconds, then probably stop listening now and fast forward. I think, the CGI characters, the fake people.
So obviously this film takes place just before A New Hope, when Grand Moff Tarkin is in charge of the Death Star. We don't know how long before, but it's not very long before A New Hope. And obviously Peter Cushing, sadly, has passed away. So rather than casting someone else, they made the bold decision of CGIing Peter Cushing's face onto a different actor. So that sounds daft. I think it's similar to how they made Arnie Hammer play two people in The Social Network by CGIing his face onto another actor so he could be twins.
Yeah.
And also they used it for Legends, that really bad Craze Brothers film, where Tom Hardy play both the Craze brothers. But in terms of technical execution, it looked convincing. The guy, it looked like Peter Cushing was, alive and well and still acting. I guess there's some debate over whether he should have done it or not. I thought it worked.
I don't know, I saw some mention of this in a review or something, so I had spoiled myself for it in that way. So I did go in being aware that Tarkin would be in this and that he would be played by the pixelated soul of Peter Cushing. So I was sort of, when he appeared, I was sort of watching him for, flickers of inhumanity. Yeah, if you really stare at him, particularly when he's interacting with other characters, there is something, I think other people have said it on the internet, there was something of the uncanny valley there. There was, or at least something of the video game cutscene in the way he sort of moved and spoke. But I think it mostly works with Tarkin, as long as you weren't, staring at it intently like I unwisely was, because he was mostly in darkness, and he's not as iconic and familiar a character as the other character they CGI'd, which is the younger Carrie Fisher as the young New Hope era Princess Leia, which was in full light and is a much more iconic character, and even though she only appeared for about 5 seconds, if that, to deliver one line, she looked a bit weird to me. That was an odd moment.
Yeah, that did look strange. Partly, I think also why it works well with Tarkin is that he is a villain. So if he comes across as a bit uncanny valley and a bit creepy, that kind of adds to his villainy. Princess Leia one did look a little strange, I think. Myself and most other people are of the opinion that we would probably been better off not to have done that cameo at the end. I mean, you got away with it with bringing Peter Cushing back. The Princess Leia one wasn't necessary.
I don't know, as I say, it might just be because the Princess Leia is more iconic. I've only seen A New Hope once, about a year ago. Yes, because I know I'm cinema's greatest monster. And yeah, I don't have an iconic image of what Peter Cushing as Moff Tarkin looks like seared into my mind. I'm happy to just go with, he probably looks and sounds like that. Whereas I can roughly remember what Princess Leia looks like.
Yeah. I think it was also a good thing that the Peter Cushing Grand Moff Tarkin character wasn't the primary villain of the film, and neither was Darth Vader. The film introduced his own villain, whose story was closely related to the story of Jyn and her father, Galen. So they could have a villain who was A, played by a flesh and blood actor, and B, kind of was closely related to this story, so his story could be self-contained, just as Jin's story is self-contained, and all the other characters are self-contained, apart from the occasional cameo of C-3PO or Darth Vader.
Yeah, I thought the new villain they created, which was Orson Krennic, apparently, played by Ben Mendelsohn, did his bit well enough. I mean, I think there's a bit of conscious decision, I think, with this film to take a step back from the sort of the Force aspect, I guess, of Star Wars. The idea that it's this sort of almost chivalrous good knights versus bad knights fight, and actually try and focus back on the idea of it as a war story with actual people in it. And therefore having a villain who's, not like a super charismatic, larger-than-life figure, but is just a kind of nasty bureaucrat, probably fits with that.
Yeah. This film excelled, or certainly benefited, from having a lot less Force-related discussion and a lot more running and shooting and flying things. I did quite like the fact that there was one of the characters, the Donnie Yen character, he was someone who believed in the Force, but I like the fact that there was this element of you don't know if he actually had any ability with the Force, because at this point in the Star Wars story, the Jedi have been completely suppressed. The Force has kind of become more like a fable, or a myth, not actually something that most people believe is real. I mean, you forget in A New Hope, when Luke first meets Han doesn't believe in the Force. He thinks it's just a story, a myth. It's not real. And in this, there was a character who believed in the Force, but you didn't know if he actually had any ability with the Force, or if it was just more like basically his religion. It existed for him based on faith alone. There was no practical, sort of physical proof of it. And I like the fact that they kept that going with that character to the end. They never revealed one way or the other whether the Force was actually with him.
Yeah, no, he does. He was a good character, actually, yes. The Donnie Yen character, he was one of the few characters who did have a certain sort of larger-than-life iconicness to him. He was good, I liked him. But yeah, the war story aspect, I think it's something that works for this film because they've actually successfully answered the immortal question, which I know we've brought up before, I think in reference to Fantastic Beasts, of this is a spin-off from an existing franchise set in the same universe but with different, or at least some different characters. Why does it exist? And the idea that it's trying to be this war story and take a different angle on the Star Wars stuff and play way down all the Jedi elements that tend to come through quite heavily in all the other films, and try and at least slightly play up the idea that this is an actual complex war. I mean, the idea that there are, good rebels and slightly murkier rebels who will just kill the prisoners if the gooder rebels don't get to them and stop them. It's not super duper nuanced. So I think some reviews have, in my humble opinion, got slightly carried away with at last a Star Wars story for grown-ups with a nuanced portrayal of war. It's okay, let's not poo ourselves. It's a more nuanced portrayal of war than A New Hope, but it's not Apocalypse Now, guys.
It still makes war look pretty fun. which is kind of the point in Star Wars. You know, Saving Private Ryan, it is not.
I mean, in my opinion, it possibly gets a bit bogged down with its own seriousness at times, but the plot structure it seems to be broadly going for is this is like a heist, this is like a caper. But as the word caper, I think, sort of carries with it, it's like those are normally a bit more sort of rollicking. Was this, with the exception of one wisecracking robot voiced by Alan Tudyk, and he was funny. There was basically no, like, comic relief or light moments outside of that.
No, but it was very, very spectacular, and I did like the big epic battle that was the third act of the film and was kind of the largest chunk of the film. The bit when they actually try to steal the plans for the Death Star. They do a good job of having like a big space battle and a big, ground battle, and all the characters have their own roles within the battle, so everyone feels very much a part of the story. No one feels superfluous. The tension is high. There's lots of great fights. There's lots of epic action scenes that are really exciting. So they do build it to this big crescendo. I was completely swept away by the big final action sequence. I thought it was very good.
Yeah, there were a couple of like space battle bits towards the end. I'm not actually going to bother explicitly spoiling them because it doesn't help me with anything. But yeah, which were properly awesome. I laughed out loud at a couple of the ridiculous bits of spectacle they fitted in towards the end. Good work, guys.
Yeah, it was very good.
The middle action sequence where they're trying to rescue Mads Mikkelsen, I thought at times was a bit dark. Not in a not for kids anymore way, but in a sort of, I'm not sure I can entirely see what's going on.
There's literally not enough light.
I guess that's another aspect of like the realistic combat element that they were maybe going for, but I could have maybe done with a few tones lighter, just so I could actually see people.
I thought there was a good action scene. It was tense. The characters were sort of playing off against each other. The sort of main supporting character, Cassian Andor, played by Diego Luna. So there's a bit when he's been told to assassinate Galen Mads Mikkelsen, a.k.a. Jin's dad. And obviously Jin is trying to save him. There's a bit you can have like an action scene that also has some character conflict in it as well. And I thought it worked. The set piece was well done in that it was kind of a dark mountainside in the pouring rain. Again, it was a bit grimmer than what we're used to. And yes, like I say, it was literally quite dark.
I thought it was a good set piece. Yeah, I liked the way they used the slightly darker edge to the rebellion with the just kill him part and sort of play that off against Jin. Yeah, that was all good. I just would like to see it a bit better. That's literally my only complaint. It was good. I guess in the wider scheme of things, it's possible this could end up being the launch point for 17 million other tangential Star Wars spin-offs. So maybe in the future we'll view this as the birth of a plague. But for now, yeah, it was fun. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, I really liked it. It made me remind me why I love Star Wars so much because of that huge thrill of excitement it gave me when I first saw the films when I was young. And this film did not let the tiny Star Wars fan inside me down.
I'm very happy for him.
Next up, we're going to be discussing the second series of The Man in the High Castle, Amazon Prime's flagship alternative history TV show based on the novel by Philip K. Dick, who has some pretty good pedigree as a sort of science fiction writer and a creator of great film adaptations, obviously Blade Runner, Total Recall, A Scanner Darkly, which we covered earlier in this podcast, all based on his books. This TV show takes place in the 1960s, but the 1960s where the Axis powers won World War II. The west coast of America is controlled by the Empire of Japan, and the majority of the rest of the country is controlled by the Nazi Reich, leaving a tiny free bit of America kind of sandwiched between the two of them. We can talk about the plot specifically in more detail. It follows a wide range of characters as they kind of try to negotiate this complex world. It's got quite a lot of attention, partly because in 2016 the image of the Statue of Liberty doing a Nazi salute seems to have resonated with some people. I can't think why. But yeah, we've seen the first episode of the new series. Nick, thoughts, opinions?
Well, I hadn't actually seen any of this until we decided to cover it for the show, so I'd watched the first 11 episodes in the last 2 weeks, and yeah, this hasn't entirely hit well for me. There's elements of it I like. A lot of it is like conceptual. The premise, the elements of the premise which I don't think you mentioned is the alternate reality element, which I think is the cool part for me. Again, mild spoilers, but this is a spoiler for something that's literally in the pilot. One of the other major plot elements is that there are these mysterious films going around which appear to show footage from other worlds, which are being collected by both Adolf Hitler and a mysterious man who, at first at least, is known only as the Man in the High Castle. So these are presented to us in the pilot in the form of the lead character Juliana finding one, and they're presented as if they're going to be quite important. And it is a sort of fascinating concept. There is a certain level of headfuck to it, because what they first see in this film is, past in our universe, like the 1960s as they really air quotes, happened. And so, yeah, the idea of this being a show about an alternate reality, which is sort of entirely from the perspective of the alternate reality, where they know they're in an alternate reality, was kind of interesting. And obviously the idea of an alternate reality where the Nazis won World War II is interesting in itself, even without the sci-fi aspect. So, yeah, I did have some expectations for this, but they didn't really... The show itself didn't really do much for me, unfortunately. I think after some thoughts, to avoid this becoming too much of a complainer, I have sort of tried to boil it down to two basic problems, which is partly it's that they chose to focus just on the internal politics of the alternate reality, really. Like, what's happening in this Nazi-controlled world with the films, the mysterious alternate reality films, just this sort of MacGuffin. For people who don't know the wanky film criticism term MacGuffin, the thing people are chasing, you know, the thing everyone wants and is killing each other to get. And they don't really address the idea that these films exist and the role they might have in the world at all between, like, the first episode where they introduce it and about episode 9 of series 1. And in fairness, in the first episode of the second season, the thing we are technically meant to be discussing, they do dig into it a bit more. The man in the high castle actually appears on camera, and they talk a bit more about what the films mean and what's in them. So it is possible that they are refocusing a bit to actually deal with the part of the show that I find interesting. But the first season did just start interesting for one episode, then have about 8 episodes of quite punishing runaround, and then they run into the other problem that there are 4 main characters, basically. This woman, Juliana, who stumbled into this, her boyfriend, Frank, who just sort of gets caught up in it, and a guy called Joe, who, again, mild pilot spoilers, is a sort of undercover Nazi spy. And there's this Nazi officer called Obergruppenführer Smith, John Smith. He's good. The other 3, unfortunately, are all kind of varying levels of dull to me. They didn't seem very developed. They have a sort of a boring love triangle, and Joe in particular did seem to be a bit of a vacuum. He doesn't have that much personality. They never say anything about his background, and you know, I guess they're trying to come across as mysterious, but it just came across as a bit vacant to me. Someone in a review I read described him as the hole in the centre of the donut, and although that's a bit facetious, it's also not inaccurate. Anyway, I've now complained for 5 solid minutes. Alastair, what did you think?
Well, I do agree with you in the fact that the sort of love triangle between, yes, as you mentioned, those sort of 3 main characters was, I felt, the weakest part of it. Partly because I think love triangles are a bit done. So at this point, I've not seen an original one in a very long time. And, you know, some of the characters really did lack chemistry. Although I do like Juliana as a character. I think she's a good protagonist, you know, much like Felicity Jones in Rogue One. She's a kind of a good weight to the centre of the story. You know, you're invested in her and you want her to succeed, or at least to survive. My favourite part of the whole show is Rufus Sewell playing Obergruppenführer Smith. He's a really fascinating portrait of how America could embrace Nazism if the Third Reich had triumphed in World War II. He is a very unusual person, being that he's an American SS officer, but in some ways he's a very familiar character. He is the conservative, authoritarian, small-town patriarch. You could see how that sort of person could be seduced or at least co-opted by Nazism. He's a man with power. He's a man who believes in things should be done a certain way. You can see he has this cold, slightly detached ideological commitment to this is the way things should be. There should be a hierarchy and I should be at the top of it. And I'm going to fight ruthlessly to enforce that. And, it works partly because Rufus Sewell is a great actor and does the part really well. They do a lot of really good sort of set pieces. Possibly one of the best episodes in the first series is when they have their 4th of July celebrations, although in this alternative universe it's Victory in America Day, celebrating the triumph of the Nazis over the Americans. And it's so weird to see what we're used to seeing from films and TV, a kind of a very traditional American 4th of July celebration, but everyone's dressed up in Nazi SS uniforms or Hitler Youth uniforms, and it's a terrifying but believable portrayal of how conservative America could embrace full-on Nazism. And I thought that was very provocative.
Yes, I mean, as I think I vaguely implied at some point during the first bit, I'm not necessarily disagreeing about Obergruppenführer Smith, although I did think his plot trailed off a bit at the end of season 1. It just sort of stopped. But yeah, I did like his character. The actor has a lot more charisma than the other 3 leads, and he was saying something interesting about the way that he's, as you say, gone from this sort of standard American patriarch into a Nazi, and the two are suspiciously similar, yet subtly different.
Yeah. And
he was actually able to do advanced moves like saying one thing and doing another, and obviously being conflicted, whereas the others were a bit prone to shouting and just yelling their motivations and having long, torturous conversations about it. Whereas, Smith just has this sort of under-the-surface tension that he can, just communicate with a look.
Where the TV show excels is that it is it's a detailed portrayal of how first of all, this society would work, Nazi or Japanese sort of will imposed on, America. But also, it, like a lot of totalitarian stories or dystopian stories, the question is, like, how would you behave in a totalitarian regime, especially like a very aggressively totalitarian regime? The Third Reich, it's not subtle in its social control. It's not a Brave New World. It's definitely a 1984. And, it takes each character and kind of, poses the question, do they try to keep their head down and survive? Do they try to embrace the new system and thrive? Do you find a way to resist in a tiny way to keep your humanity? Do you find a way to resist in a major way, which obviously could be extremely dangerous? And it does a good job of asking those questions we're familiar from dystopian or totalitarian stories by showing how everyone interacts with the kind of oppressive system.
Yeah, but it doesn't really do much of a job of shaping it into a story. Stuff just sort of happens, and occasionally stuff just happens and then gets ignored for about 5 episodes because it's not time to address it yet.
Yeah.
There's an attempt on Smith's life at like the very start of season 1. I think it's in the 2nd episode or something. He then investigates it for 1 episode, forgets about it for 5 episodes, and then it comes back up again at the end when it needs to be used for the finale. And there's also a bit where a major Japanese official gets shot. There's like an assassination attempt, which again is an imperative, important thing for 1 episode, and then it's gently ignored for about 5 weeks.
It fizzles along in the background of the plot, the first series, but doesn't really become important until it's needed. I think you're right that the show is slow-paced and may have benefited from being shorter, not 11 episodes.
Something like that, yeah, but I get that they're adapting what is, based on a quick Google, quite a short novel into a TV show that I'm guessing they want to last the usual 5 to 7 years. But it feels like they're hamstrung by that to a quite unpleasant extent. I mean, the fact that they can't move the plot forward more than like a few atoms means they can't do much with the interesting bit, and they've had to introduce what does feel like a lot like narrative hamster wheeling into the middle of the season. I mean, a lot of that stuff with the various assassination attempts and just the running around, the film's over there, it just feels like it's just stuff to fill the space. It's a combination of that and a lot of like ponderous shots of people thinking.
I would, agree with that analysis. I have read the novel it's based on, and it's a good book. And when I knew they were making this, I was like, 11-hour-long episodes? I thought they would do the whole book in the first series, and I thought, it's going to be, they're going to have to find some other stuff to put in this story because it's quite a short book, and 11-hour-long episodes is quite a lot of TV. Even at the end of the first series, they haven't covered much of the book at all. It is moving quite slowly through quite a short book.
Imagine, if you will, my surprise.
The other thing about this book is it's a very esoteric book. It's not particularly cinematic, unlike, things like Blade Runner. Well, novel was called Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. But it is a very esoteric book. A lot of it is more about how people think about this system and their kind of emotional interactions with it. And the Übergriffen Führer Smith isn't in the book at all. It's an unusual choice in that it's not a particularly cinematic story, and they have made a very visual cinematic story out of it, but by changing the book quite a lot.
Just out of interest, I don't want to say what you tell me everything that happens in the book, but is the element of we've got to get the films, let's run around and chase the films, is that in the book, or is that something they've added to give the characters something to do for most of the season?
It is in the book, but in the book, it's also a book they're chasing, to make it more confusing. So these films are called The Grasshopper Lies Heavy. In the book, there's only one book, and it's called The Grasshopper Lies Heavy. So it's just a novel that's been passed around. And we're getting a bit spoilery, certainly for the book now. The thing in the book within the book of the Grasshopper is kind of, in the book, it's supposed to be just a novel. It's not supposed to be a window into an alternative reality. At least that's the way I interpreted it. It was just this kind of seditious thing that freedom fighters had created. They basically, in order to inspire people to fight against the Japanese and the Nazis, someone had written this novel that said, imagine a world, where we didn't have to live like this. Imagine a world where we triumphed. It's more like a symbol of hope. They've made it a much more concrete sci-fi thing in the TV show. But there is the plot of Juliana trying to find the man in the high castle who's written this novel, and she's knocking around with this guy Joe, again, who wants to find him as well, and he's, a Nazi agent, and because he wants to assassinate the person to stop, the kind of the sedition which is this book is a source of. They've certainly embellished on that a lot. I like the fact in the TV show they've changed it from a book to being a film because we're going to a visual medium, so we're going to make the MacGuffin visual. That was the right decision to make. But the whole fact of it kind of being this sort of window into different realities and stuff, that's definitely, they've embellished upon that because the book is in the book, but not very much.
Okay. I mean, I've not read the book. I did kind of assume, I guess, because Philip K. Dick has this reputation for being quite an odd, esoteric writer. I sort of assumed that the alternate reality aspect was the main thing they'd ported directly from the book.
Well, it's an alternative in the sense that it's real if you imagine it's real. I mean, there's a bit in the first episode of the second series when they meet the man in the high castle and he's like, he taps his head and goes, "My castle is up here." And I think that's what they mean in the kind of that, like, if you believe in it, it's real, but it's not supposed to be literally. But that's one of the differences between having a book and a film. If it's a film, it must be a literal thing that you can see. It being a book, it's kind of like, is this story supposed to be real? Is it a metaphor? Is it actually from an alternative reality? I mean, it's left quite ambiguous.
I mean, that in some ways makes it interesting to see where they'll take it. Yeah, as I say, I would like to see more of that and less internal politics stuff, because I don't think like that was the most interesting bit. A lot of Juliana's actions are motivated by these feelings towards Joe. Like, you know, she'll often do something which most people will consider quite irrational because she wants to help or save Joe, which does then expose the bigger hole that they have very little chemistry. So,
yeah.
So you sit there going, you've just basically betrayed or screwed over your boyfriend to help protect this man you barely have any chemistry with. This is kind of frustrating. I have no idea if it's the actor's fault or the writing's fault. There is quite a lot of lengthy expository conversations where they say each other's names a lot. Like, seriously, the number of times where someone says the name of the person they're talking to in The Man in the High Castle is not realistic. But, yeah, I don't know. I feel like there's a definite vibe of we want to be premium telly here, which means long conversations and sort of slow-ticking plots, but it just doesn't quite... The actual characters and plot aren't quite good enough to fill this sort of empty space that has been left for insert characterisation here.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah, I'm assuming you didn't have these problems, at least not to the same degree.
No, I don't know if I was just more invested in it or more carried along by it. I mean, I certainly agree with the flaws you've identified, certainly the lack of chemistry, and as I said before, the love triangle that motivates a lot of the characters' action is fairly predictable and dull. So I certainly agree with those. I just think, I don't know, maybe I can't quantify it, but I did get more invested in the whole thing. Maybe it's because I read the book and I really liked it, or maybe it's because I just really liked I was really interested in the fictional universe they created and just wanted to see people explore it more, and I didn't mind if it was explored in a somewhat dull way.
I know alternate histories, or sort of sci-fi tinged alternate histories, are, I guess, very much your jam, which is why I keep recommending them to you in comic form. So,
yeah, and I do like them. So yeah, that maybe that is why. And I think it's possible also a simple thing that I watched it over a longer period of time than you did. So maybe it didn't feel quite as slow paced if you were watching it slower. I mean, maybe it was the flaws were less obvious.
It's true, maybe you could sit back and luxuriate in the world building. There were some interesting details scattered through about how, you know, this Nazi-Japanese co-run America might work, and sort of the Nazi version of the Scouts and school, and the bit where that kid is reading a comic which is called Ranger Reich, which is a terrible pun, but what the hell. Yeah, what did you think of, since, again, that's technically meant to be the main point of this segment, what did you think of the actual second season premiere? I
found it interesting. I liked, as you said, that they finally introduced the man in the high castle himself. They moved some of the plots on. I like the fact that they've brought back a minor character from the first series, who's actually, I think, one of the major characters in the book. So they brought back Chilton, who runs a shop of American collectibles. There's a sort of fascination with, because the Japanese are interested in American culture because I guess they're dominating it and suppressing it, but they're also interested in it. And he's one of the main characters in the book. There's a lot of him in the book. There's also a lot of discussion of why this stuff is valuable and desired by the Japanese and the kind of various artistic and sort of slightly spiritual properties that the Japanese associate with this American culture. A lot of it which are just things like Mickey Mouse buttons and stuff which we would consider to be, just sort of junk, but it's taken on a different value, and that kind of the different nature of that value is gone into at length in the book. Probably for the best they didn't port that to the TV show. But the Chilton character is an interesting one because, as I say, a lot of the show is based around the idea of how would you interact with, or, how would you try to live in this totalitarian system. And his response is he's embracing it. He lives in the Japanese-controlled area, and he kind of wants to adopt Japanese culture and kind of be accepted by the Japanese occupiers, which is an issue because he's not Japanese. And he's an interesting character, and I like the fact they brought him back. I do like him, actually. He was a bit of a ray of sunshine in the first season, in the I think 3 or 4 episodes he was in, because firstly he's one of the only characters in this show with anything resembling a sense of humour, and had some interesting emotions as he sort of tries desperately to fit in with this Japanese culture. It was just a slightly more
Yeah, he just had some slightly more interesting scenes than angst over love triangle stuff.
Yeah, definitely. One of my favourite characters from the first series, who's got a lot to do in the first episode of the second series, is the Japanese trade minister, played by Keri Hiroyuki Tagawa. And I think he's a great actor and really does the part well. It's a character with a lot of nuance. Again, he's a man who is very much invested in the Japanese imperial system because he's got a good job and his identity is based on his role in the system, but is growing to question it and its cruelties. And he does that, again, emotionally conflicted very well. He has interesting plot lines, and they're stepping up his story in the second series, mainly, which is one of the background plots, which is that there is a brewing conflict between Imperial Japan and the Nazi Reich because they're both the dominant powers in the world, and I guess one must defeat the other at some point. And he's obviously very much in that story, and I like him as a character, and I'm glad, hopefully he gets more to do in the second series.
Yeah, I went back and forth with that character. Sometimes his scenes just seem to be a bit staring into space, looking mournful, without really going anywhere, but on the other hand, he has had a couple of big interesting bits. I think if they just push him into action a bit, I could quite like him. But yeah, I liked Stephen Root as the man in the High Castle, just because Stephen Root is a very good actor. And they introduced a new character, Gary, played by Callum Keith Rennie in The Resistance.
Yes.
Who he said he brings a bit more of a sort of dangerous, charismatic edge to it, because it's felt a bit of a safe, generic Resistance until now. Although it is, I guess, a bit obvious to spice things up by bringing in an edgy white dude who shoots people. Also, he establishes his role by killing off the woman who used to be in charge. Never mind.
That's always a good intro for a character.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I haven't read the book. I don't know if he's in the book. Is he? Is that of interest?
I don't think so. There are quite a lot of characters in the book. However, they haven't brought many of them over. Some of them, they've changed their names. They've kept the same characters and changed their name for no apparent reason.
But yeah, I mean, Gary did feel like an effort to make the Resistance a bit more interesting. And, you know, to be fair, it wouldn't hurt for that part of the plot to feel a bit more edgy and dangerous. Okay, next up, we were talking about the new film The Birth of a Nation, a period drama based on the story of Nat Turner, a man who led a slave rebellion in 1831. This is a film co-written, co-produced, directed and starring Nate Parker as Nat Turner. I'm assuming it's a bit of a passion project for him. It's a very epic, sprawling biopic telling the story of Turner's life up to and including his rebellion and subsequent death. Spoilers. And yet there's been some controversy around this film, both because of its aggressively pro-civil rights stance and because I believe there was some controversy around the main creator, Nate Parker himself, and some historic rape allegations that re-emerged during the promotion of the film, which has, I gather, dented its Oscar buzz somewhat, but nonetheless, we have seen it. Alastair, what did you think of it?
In terms of the film, I thought it was very good. It was very powerful. I wouldn't say it was an enjoyable experience to watch it, but it was certainly affecting. Yeah, it doesn't shy away from the obvious awfulness of slavery and what it was like. You know, this film it's very historically accurate, or at least it's certainly historically believable. It does really show the grim realities of slavery, which we could go into in more detail, but it's quite unpleasant.
Yeah, imagine people being whipped.
Yeah, and a lot of worse stuff. But
yeah,
it's interesting. This film reminded me, obviously, quite a lot of 12 Years a Slave that came out 3 years ago, another film about slavery. There's some debate around both of them, and this film certainly reminded the debate, which is people say it shows how awful slavery was. And there's an element of people saying, you know, some people were saying, we know how bad slavery was. Why do we need films, you know, shoving it in our face? And I think we do need them, and I think we're very important for a number of reasons. I think it's important that we actively remember how bad it was so that it doesn't fade from our memory. I think there's a lot of, you know, very well-made history about the slavery, you know, books, documentaries that obviously go into a more, you know, historical perspective. But those things tend to not reach a wide audience. You know, so dramatic films, things that presented as stories, even if stories based on real events, do reach a wider audience. And also I think we do just need to be reminded of how awful it was, to be visually represented in front of us, the terrible things that we did, so that we actively remember them. And I think the film achieves all of those things, and I think it's a good and important piece of filmmaking. And what were your thoughts, Nick?
I think in cultural context terms, it's definitely good and important that this film exists. I mean, it's, in terms of the actual film, it's on some levels quite a sort of standard Hollywood biopic. There's something very recognisable about it. But the fact that it's about a black civil rights hero, and that it does not shy away from making him very much the hero. Yeah, even the one sympathetic, or at least sort of sympathetic slave master, played by Arnie Hammer, is ultimately revealed as not having that much tolerance really when he encounters even the slightest pushback from his slaves, and ultimately suffers the same grisly fate as a lot of the other ones who appear on screen. Again, it's very uncompromising in that way, you know. It in some ways reflects a lot of the debates that are still happening around liberalism today. Like, this man probably had good intentions, or at least better intentions than a lot of the other slave masters who are openly torturing their slaves for no good reason. But on the other hand, he's not actually doing much, and therefore, in an uncompromising sense, do intentions matter that much? And that sort of thing is interesting.
Yes, I think you're definitely right there. You've hit on what is the interesting kernel of the story. It shows a lot of the complexity around slavery. Now, as you cover by saying, yes, slavery was awful, and it was awful to pretty much everyone who was sending a slave. But the film goes into the complexity of it, and it shows how different people experienced slavery in different ways. Such as you do get a sense that Nat's owner is, you know, amongst slave owners, nicer. He's not torturing, you know, or whipping his slaves for no reason. But again, when pushed, you know, he still views these human beings as his property to do with as he wants. It shows a lot of the power dynamics within slavery, such as, you know, how the domestic slaves consider themselves to be superior to the farm slaves who work in the fields, because the domestic slaves were closer to the masters, and therefore they felt a sense of superiority, and that's in the film. Another interesting thing about the film is how Nate, obviously, he lives on this farm and kind of really understands only slavery as his own experience, but then his master makes money because he becomes a preacher. He learns how to read, he studies the Bible, he preaches, and his master makes money by renting him out, I guess, to other slave owners so that he can preach to the slaves to make them more docile and compliant. And then that's when Nate steps outside his own experience and sees other people's experience of slavery. He realizes the full awfulness of it and how he's, to some degree, more fortunate. Also similar to The Man in the High Castle, one of the questions very much is how, again, do you interact with a totalitarian system? How do you behave? And there's some slaves rebel in a minor way. Nat Turner obviously rebels in a big way, but there's huge risk, not only to himself, but to other people not even associated with the rebellion he leads, who just get killed because of the huge backlash against him. And it shows us like various slaves who oppose Nat Turner's uprising because they're frightened. They don't want to challenge the authority of the masters because they know the reprisals will be brutal and indiscriminate.
Yeah, I think the way it sort of deploys the big violent rebellion at the end, I think it is meant to on some level feel cathartic, but it feels slightly more considered than like Django Unchained, where you were clearly just meant to an extent, punch the air and go fuck yeah when Django starts shooting all the slave masters in huge numbers.
Yeah.
And doesn't feel quite that simple when the rebellion finally happens and Nat Turner and his friends do quite violently take out some slave owners. I mean, I think it is meant to feel righteous, but it's not meant to be quite as action movie punch the air. There's something quite sad when, again, spoilers, we can't seem to discuss anything without spoiling it, when Turner does kill his master at the end.
Yeah, I think you're right. There's definitely tonal differences to Django Unchained. It is presented in a slightly more nuanced way. And yeah, you're right, it is a sort of a righteous anger, well, partly because he's a preacher and he's invoking the Bible to inspire his uprising.
Yeah.
There's a righteous anger of Nat Turner. But there's also, again, there's that element of, because it's basically a more realistic film than Django Unchained, the fact that it's not that we don't think it's wrong for Nate to seek reprisals against the cruelty of his masters. There is an element of people saying this isn't going to end well. A lot of people will be punished. People who aren't even connected to Nate in any way. Like I say, Nate has a grand vision of overthrowing the entire, southern economic and social system and liberating all the slaves. And there is an element saying if you don't achieve that goal, which we know he doesn't, because slavery survived a long time after 1831, the system will reprise and it will be merciless and brutal.
I mean, in terms of it being like a predictable or doomed story, although the existence of this film is very interesting and, as I say, sort of subversive culturally, it's kind of very standard biopic in a lot of ways. It's particularly from about halfway through, you do see most of the plot turns happening about 10-15 minutes before they finally happen. And I mean, despite all this, it is traumatic enough for you to still feel this sort of sad desolation in the inevitable sad ending, because there is, a real starkness to how bad things do get compared to a lot of these biopics. There's scenes of, like, as you sort of implied just now, sort of mass lynchings that follow Turner's Rebellion, which are pretty haunting. But yeah, it is a standard Hollywood biopic, and the fact that it's about a black civil rights hero is very good and relevant. But it does look... It looks exactly like every other film about slavery. There's not any new imagery here. There's lots of, like, wooden buildings and empty rocking chairs, and the masters all look pretty redneck stereotypes. It's not breaking any bounds in terms of how one films a biopic or how one films the concept of slavery.
No, you're right there. It is interesting that this is very much a familiar historical biopic, but the one thing that makes this different is, first of all, that the character that they're focusing on is, a black person. There aren't that many biopics of, African-American figures. I think even more significant, though, is that it's, written and directed by a black man. There aren't as many, African-American directors and writers and things. We're all familiar with actors who've gone on to do these big personal projects, kind of where they want to write, direct, act, kind of like Clint Eastwood in Unforgiven, or Mel Gibson when he made Braveheart, starring, directing, producing, working, doing all these things in this film.
I think Nate Parker has actually said that Braveheart was something that inspired him in making this, I think, in some interview. Yeah, a lot of the beats are there. It's one of the things that does make it feel, even though its existence is kind of unique, it also makes it feel a bit standard.
Yeah, I think it's different because the fact that it is like a passion project from an African-American who's been given this level of, like, creative freedom, and that's unusual. But if you kind of remove it from the context, it is sort of strange that it's not particularly different to most historical biopics, Braveheart being the obvious example.
Which is why, though, I don't know if it's going to be showered with Oscars.
Yeah, it's interesting how Hollywood will respond to this film, because also liberal America is obviously very self-conscious right now that the rest of America has sent a very strong message about racism to the rest of the world and exactly how they view it.
What, go away, stop banging on about it?
Yeah, and basically that, we're going to vote for a president who has, actively encouraged racism and expressed racist views. Or is racist. Let's not beat around the bush here. So it's possible liberal America may respond to this by showering a film about the horrors of racism with awards and praise to draw attention to it. Or it's possible that liberal America, much like the rest of America, is also deeply racist. So they, like say, there was Oscars So White last year.
I'm not implying that not liking this film makes you racist, by the way. I still think this film was a bit standard.
Now, I'm not saying not liking this film makes you racist. I'm saying that the problems of racism in America may be one of the barriers to this film being as widely received. If it had been a similar film but about a white person, directed by a white person, it's possible it would be received in a different way. I'm not saying it's racist to dislike this film. I'm saying there is certainly, you can't remove it from the context of racism in America, both now and historically.
Yeah, no, as you say, the reception is going to be interesting, although the perception I have, based on a bit of reading around and a couple of other reviews, is that the controversy around the creator has led it to kind of fizzling out a bit. I don't think it did particularly well at the box office when it came out in America a little while ago, and for what little connection I have to that, I don't think there's much Oscar buzz around it anymore, but we will see what happens.
This is our last regular episode of the year, and we decided to do something Christmassy. So I have recommended Nick watch my favourite Christmas movie of all time, Die Hard. Bruce Willis is John McClane, a New York cop who arrives in LA on Christmas Eve to spend Christmas with his wife and kids. He heads to his wife's Christmas party on the 30th floor of the Nakatomi building. Unfortunately, his reunion is spoiled by Alan Rickman and his band of heavily armed baddies who take everyone hostage, and it's up to John McClane to save them. So, Nick, what did you think of this festive treat?
Yeah, the fact that I've never seen Die Hard before is embarrassing, but anyway, yes, of course it's good. I mean, it's one of the solid action classics. It's, the contained setting, the way they never actually get out of that setting. A lot of films which take place in those sort of contained settings tend to give in to the temptation to, like, leave that setting for the final showdown. But I appreciated the way they did genuinely stick it in, the way that everything that was shown in the film earlier comes towards the ending. There's a watch and a photo, and they all end up being relevant somehow. It makes it feel like a very complete, satisfying, good cinematic experience. Even the fact that I know the character stars in some slightly rubbish films later on doesn't really tarnish this one, because it isn't built as a franchise. There's no massive cliffhanger or subplot to build the next film, which lets us reflect on how terribly it all went later. Lots of action bits, a lot of satisfying explosions. It's hard to deny it's a very man film. The one woman character doesn't get a huge amount to do, but, it does have that reputation, and it is still built like clockwork. So, yes, this may shock you, but I enjoyed watching Die Hard. It is a good film.
It is very good. I hadn't seen it in years when I rewatched this, and I pretty much from the beginning I was just reminded of how well made this film is. It's very precise. It's just technically well executed. It's very, very tense. So the whole thing, the tension is sort of sustained, is kept at a high level and sustained throughout, which is really very good. There's some moments, even though I'd seen this film several times before and I knew what was going to happen, I still was kind of gripping my seat, moments like when John McClane has to jump off the roof of the building because it's exploding and tries to use a fire hose to kind of swing round into a lower story. Even though I knew exactly what's going to happen, I felt really kind of, real. I felt real tensions. It's an obvious because it's a very well-known film, but it's difficult to understate how well executed this relatively simple premise is.
Yeah, and also the late Alan Rickman is excellent as Hans Gruber, the terrorist, with again a surprisingly dense plan that still makes sense and still fits into the clockwork trappings of this film. And yeah, he has this sort of weird obsession with John McClane because he's a villain, but it never seems ridiculous. It never seems overplayed. It seems like he's annoyed with him because he's in the way, and then he deals with it and moves on. The character feels consistent and not like a supervillain, but he's still this big, larger-than-life performance. It's great.
Yeah, he is very good in this film. And sadly, Alan Rickman was one of the people we lost this year. Excellent actor. And this film, he's just so watchable in it. He kind of commands every single scene he's in. I really like the section when Alan Rickman meets John McClane, but Hans Gruber pretends to be one of the hostages.
Yeah.
And, and he's really good how he, his performance changes and becomes so different.
Yeah, I mean, Bruce Willis doesn't get to do quite as much, sort of show-off, speechy acting, but it's very assured, natural movie star stuff. It's very raw charisma. He's very good. And he takes his top at the end, radiates some sexual magnetism and reminds us he's the alpha male, and then he kills the guy in the suit. Job done.
Yeah.
It's almost a hard film to analyse at length because it's a very sort of ticking watch of precision. It's a good film. It works. I may actually have to watch the two sequels that I haven't seen. Yeah, and obviously the reason we're covering this now, and to be honest, the one major point of cultural discussion that still exists around this film, apart from the general acknowledgement that it's quite good, is this a Christmas film? It's definitely a film that takes place at Christmas, but does that make it a Christmas film?
It's got a lot of Christmas music in it, which is, the main theme is, weather inside is frightful, and the fire is so delightful. Let it snow, let it snow. So yeah, there's a lot of Christmas music in it, especially the end credits play out to a Christmas song. There's general Christmas songs scattered throughout.
I mean, some people would say the main test of that is, could you extract all the Christmas elements and would the film still work? And the answer is probably yes, but at the same time, I think it would be a shame. I think the Christmas parts do add something.
Yeah, I guess there's a reason why everyone's sort of gathered together for in the evening, because it's the Christmas party. Also, the fact that the central sort of personal conflict of the film is John McClane's wife and his marriage is under stress because his wife has moved to Los Angeles and he lives in New York and is a New York cop. And obviously the Christmas is the thing that's bringing them together, and he wants Christmas to go well, but also because of the tensions in their relationship, he argues and he's worried he's going to, they're going to fight and spoil it. So the setting around Christmas, the bringing together people at Christmas is kind of what makes this film work. Because if it wasn't Christmas, if Hans Gruber invaded that building at any other point, John McClane wouldn't have been there because he'd be doing his job.
I'm sure anyone who was thinking about it could pull together some other reason why they were having a party and John McClane was coming. But just sort of this universal idea of a warm, nice family Christmas does, I think, adds to the idea of there being something John McClane's fighting for.
There's an element that he's annoyed with his wife because his wife has switched back to using her maiden name, in her professional life, and her use of her maiden name does feed into the plot in a very kind of relevant way. There is a lot of tension as you're wondering, God, at what point is Hans going to find out that this is John McClane's wife and he can use that to his advantage?
Yeah, although, it's meant to be Christmas Eve, isn't it? That's not like the 23rd. It's supposed to be your actual Christmas Eve.
Yes, that's when it's set.
I'm not American, but is it normal to have a big late-night drinky office party on Christmas Eve? Don't people have families to travel back to?
I guess they're hard-working. It's a big, successful company, and she's director of a part of it. So I guess they work right up until Christmas because Christmas Eve isn't a public holiday.
Yeah, but normally people either knock off early or at least, once they leave the office at closing time, but then have to go home and see their families. Anyway, oh God, have I found a plot hole in Die Hard? Have I just ruined it for myself?
I think it works as it is. The Christmas setting, I think, also adds a level of extra tragedy. I don't know, it sounds a bit silly, but on top of everything, the terrorists have ruined Christmas.
Yeah, I think it adds a lot. I think the reason some people get a bit annoyed about the whole "it's the best Christmas film" thing is because it's not a film about Christmas. Christmas is an element in the plot, and I think it would lessen the film to remove it, but it's not a film about Christmas. Although, you know, a lot of fiction seems to take place in this weird void where time of year doesn't exist. It's just a day. Yeah, so the fact that it does actually date itself to a specific time of year does actually make it feel better and more convincing. At least until, like, people start jumping out of windows on fire hoses.
Yeah, no, you're right about that. One of the reasons why I think it's the greatest Christmas film of all time is because, unlike almost every other Christmas film, this one isn't particularly smolchy. There's no kind of, you know, magical Christmas. Like, there's the peak of Christmas smolchiness, I think, is the Doctor Who episode when the villain is defeated because of the raw emotion of a child crying on Christmas Day.
That is basically all the Doctor Who Christmas specials. That is the one time where they just give themselves permission to do a Power of Love ending.
Yeah, and I quite like the fact that Die Hard is not schmaltzy about Christmas. It is set at Christmas, but it's not. It is not the power of love that defeats Hans Gruber. It's John McClane sellotaping a gun to his back and then throwing him out of a building.
Yeah, I'm fully expecting another Power of Love ending in next week's Doctor Who Christmas special. I've just had to start giving them that. Just let them do it, whatever. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, maybe I am being overly schmaltzy and mainstream, but I do still want some what is Christmas is good out of my Christmas films. So I'm still voting Muppets Christmas Carol, to be honest.
Maybe next year we can do Jingle All the Way. We'll see how you feel, if that's Christmassy enough.
Actually, in a weird twist from the usual, I have actually seen Jingle All the Way, I think. Am I thinking of Last Action Hero?
Well, Jingle All the Way is the one at Christmas.
Really? Yeah, I've definitely seen a crap Arnold Schwarzenegger film which exists to placate children. I just can't remember which one it is. I don't know. I think the sense of annoyance that seems to have emerged, the inevitable backlash over this idea of Die Hard being a Christmas film or the best Christmas film is just one of these things where people say things 1,000 times as a joke or a semi-joke and then just eventually becomes this sort of weird accepted truth and then people get annoyed by it. It's an endless cycle that turns and turns.
For me, at least, Die Hard evokes the kind of the memories of Christmas from, you know, back from when you were a child, and Christmas was a more magical experience because we weren't, you know, cynical and world weary. And there is, you know, Christmas is one of those times, I guess, when we do remember the kind of enthusiasm and love we had for Christmas when we were young. And for me, Die Hard completely evokes that, because it's just something I associate predominantly with Christmas.
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously I didn't see Die Hard till last Tuesday, so it doesn't evoke quite the same nostalgia for me. Although last Tuesday was all that, yeah, it was alright. But yeah, no, it's a good film, it's a nice film. I liked it. It's a good recommendation. Merry Christmas, everyone.
Merry Christmas. So that was Die Hard. I'm glad you enjoyed seeing it, Nick. What are you going to recommend for me to enjoy over the Christmas period that we can then discuss in the first episode of 2017?
Well, it's going to be another comic. I considered not doing a comic, but then I decided no. It's going to be the first volume of JLA Justice League of America, but it is called JLA, by Grant Morrison and Howard Porter, because we've had a few conversations offline recently about how I've been recommending you stuff that, you know, is very much in your wheelhouse, you know, the alternate history, Manhattan Projects, Man in the High Castle, Uber area. So I think it's been a while since we've actually done a superhero comic, so I thought after 20-something episodes we should finally go straight into the deep end and read a proper mainstream superhero comic with Batman, Superman and Aquaman in it.
Yeah, I've never read, I think, many mainstream superhero comics. I think we read a bit of DC Rebirth earlier this year. That was probably my most exposure to actual superhero comics as opposed to, you know, the films or TV shows. So yeah, I'll be interested to see what an actual traditional superhero comic actually is like.
Well, I mean, it's by Grant Morrison, who's known for being Scottish and a bit esoteric, so it's on the slightly credible end of the superhero comic spectrum, but yeah, it's definitely full-on action superhero stuff. This is the comic that made me actually like DC characters other than Batman, basically, because when I was a teenager it was basically Batman is cool, Superman, Aquaman, Wonder Woman, The Flash, The Martian Manhunter, and some others are all stupid. But then I read Grant Morrison's JLA, and unlike the recent Zack Snyder films, it did persuade me that they could be cool. So hopefully this will maybe get you at least slightly excited for that Justice League film, but we'll probably have to cover next year.
Well, we'll find out next year, which is a couple of weeks away.
Right, and that's all your festive moderate fantasy violence. Thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed the show, then we have a website at moderatefantasyviolence.com where you can get all our episodes, all our deleted scenes under the excessive fantasy violence banner. We have actually had a couple for recent episodes, including some spoilers for The Hanging Tree, and I think a bit of extra stuff about The Walking Dead from a recent episode as well, so check those out. Also on the website lately is an article by me, unusually, about my feelings about Spider-Man clone Ben Reilly, following on for some recent events in the Spider-Man comics. So if you want to read about my childhood and Spider-Man clones, then this is definitely your best chance so far. So check that out. Also, you can subscribe on iTunes and leave a review. I know we have actually got a review now, so thanks to iTunes user Low on Credit. who gave us 4 stars and said some nice things. So, yeah, if you want to be like Mr. Credit and potentially get a mention on the show, then do go and give us a review. We would greatly appreciate it as a nice Christmas present.
You can also follow us on Twitter, where we are at MFV Podcast, or you can become a fan of ours on Facebook. I've been Alastair Ball. You can follow me on Twitter at Alastair J.R. Ball. You can also find more of my writing at redtrainblog.com.
And I've been Nick Bryan. Jolly Old Saint Nick is my work name. You can find more from me at nickbryan.com. You can also follow me on Twitter as @nickmb. And yeah, that's all for this episode. In the next proper episode in 2 weeks' time, we'll be talking about Sherlock and Doctor Who, so Stephen Moffat fans rejoice. I wasn't entirely being sarcastic. We're, I think, still broadly positive about Stephen Moffat. And we'll also be covering, of course, JLA Volume 1. So that's the first 9 issues for those of you who still have the individual episodes. But there will actually be another episode before that. In 1 week's time, we'll be attempting to drop some sort of year in review thing. Now, we're actually going to record this live and in person, rather than this Skype thing we normally do. So, assuming that it's not a complete disaster and we've managed to record ourselves audibly and not delete it somehow, then that should appear, because we both have, lives and families. I'm reluctant to commit firmly to a release date over Christmas, but what I'm aiming for is the Thursday between the 2 Thursdays we have regular episodes on, which is the 29th. Certainly, worst case scenario, I want to get it out before the actual end of 2016, so it's still, timely. And I'll probably also put my top 10 TV shows up on the Moderate Fantasy Violence website at around the same time, so look out for that. But in terms of regular episodes, that is us done for the year. Thank you for listening. Hopefully we will see you in a week for our booze-fueled New Year celebrations. Well, booze-filled 2016 retrospectives, so it might just turn into sad junks being sad. We'll have to see. But yep, until then, Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas. May your Christmases be German terrorist-free.
It's true, we're recording this on the 18th of December. There's still time for your work to be stormed by terrorists. But hopefully it won't happen, because that would be a really depressing ending to 2016.
Yeah, it would be thematically appropriate. Merry Christmas, everyone. Merry Christmas.
Ho, 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 and to all a good night, said jolly old Saint Nick in a crushing monotone.